On the night I turned 57, instead of singing me happy birthday, they poured red wine over my head and laughed like I was the evening's entertainment. That's the truth of how it started, and it is the reason I can no longer keep quiet about what it means to be the woman I am, a black woman of my age, who gave her life to raising children, to working double shifts, to being present when others disappeared, only to sit at her own birthday table and feel the sting of wine dripping into her eyes while cameras flashed and voices jeered. I had dressed carefully for that night, pulling out the one dress that still made me feel elegant, a long red gown that hugged my figure and reminded me of younger days when men at church socials would ask me to dance. I had straightened my hair, slipped on earrings my late mother once gave me, and carried myself with the dignity of a woman who had survived too many storms to count. Yet in the middle of my own dining room, under lights I had paid the bills to keep burning for years, my so-called family decided humiliation would be my gift. The wine was cold, sharp against my scalp, soaking into the dress I had chosen with care, and I heard the laughter echo around me as though I had been placed on a stage. Some of them had their phones raised, recording it, making sure the moment could live longer than the night itself, because cruelty seems to need an audience these days. I remember staring down at my hands, seeing the rings that told the story of decades of labor and sacrifice, and thinking that if my mother could see this, she would whisper the same words she told me at 12 years old when I came home crying from school after being called out of my name. Baby, don't you ever let them laugh at your pain without you turning it into your power. At that table, they thought they were breaking me, but what they were doing was lighting a fuse. The smell of spilled Merlot filled the room, and the voices around me blended into a chorus of mockery. One cousin shouted that I was always so uptight, now loosened up at last, and another clapped like a child at a circus act. Even my own son, the boy I carried through long nights of fever and asthma attacks, stood off to the side smirking, his arms crossed, his silence saying more than words ever could. Betrayal has a weight that presses down on your chest, heavier than bricks, heavier than loss, because it doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the very people you fed, clothed, and forgave 100 times over. As the wine ran into my eyes, blurring my vision, I blinked back tears, not of weakness, but of rage, knowing deep down that this scene was not just about disrespect. It was about erasing me, about reducing me to nothing more than a joke in my own home. I had spent my life proving I was worthy of respect in a country where black women over 50 rarely receive it. I had stood behind hospital counters for 20 years as a nurse's aide, pushing through 12-hour shifts, lifting bodies twice my size, holding dying hands that trembled with fear. I had stretched paychecks to keep the lights on, skipping meals so my children never had to, working second jobs, cleaning houses, where women younger than me looked through me like I was invisible. Yet on the night, meant to celebrate my years, all those sacrifices evaporated in the eyes of people who had convinced themselves that cruelty was comedy. They laughed, and in their laughter was a history too familiar. The sound of our pain turned into someone else's amusement. When I pushed back my chair and stood, the room quieted for a heartbeat. Maybe they expected me to scream, to curse, to collapse. But I had learned long ago that silence can wound deeper than shouting. I wiped the wine from my face with the back of my hand, straightened my soaked dress, and looked each one of them in the eye. I wanted them to see what they had created, to see the woman they thought they could humiliate into submission. I remembered being a teenager in Alabama, standing in front of a classroom where a teacher mocked my accent, and deciding that day never to bow my head again. The same fire rose up in me now. I walked slowly around the table, every step leaving wet footprints on the hardwood floor, the wine dripping from my sleeves like blood. They shifted in their seats, uneasy now that the laughter had faded, and they were left facing the weight of what they had done. My grandson, barely 12, looked down at his plate, ashamed. And for a moment, my heart cracked again, because children learn cruelty from what they see. The women at the table busied themselves with napkins, pretending to clean, refusing to meet my gaze. But the men leaned back, smirking still, daring me to challenge them. I could have shouted then, could have unleashed the years of bitterness that had built inside me, but I chose something different. I let the silence stretch long enough for them to squirm, and then I whispered, almost to myself, but loud enough for them all to hear, "You will regret this night." Those words landed in the room heavier than the laughter had, because they came not as a threat, but as a promise born of pain. They didn't know yet what I had prepared, what I had already set in motion before this dinner even began, but I knew, because a woman my age does not survive by accident. She survives by planning, by reading the signs, by knowing when to call for help. That birthday table was not just a scene of humiliation. It was the stage on which they revealed who they truly were, and it was the place where I decided to stop protecting people who would never protect me. I thought of every time I had covered for them, lied to neighbours about the shouting that rattled my walls, given them money I could not afford to lose, swallowed insults so the family could look intact from the outside. All of that ended the second that glass tilted and the wine ran down my head. The moment they turned my celebration into a weapon, they freed me from any obligation to keep their secrets. I want you to understand the hook of this story is not just the wine, not just the laughter, but the truth that at a certain age, a black woman learns that dignity must be claimed, not given. That night, soaked and humiliated, I made a decision. When the lights went out minutes later, no one knew it was I who had already arranged for a call to be made, who had already whispered to an ally that the time had come. And when the lights came back on, I was not alone. Behind me stood the people they never expected to see. Uniforms, badges, eyes that would not look away. But that comes later. For now, all you need to remember is the image of a woman drenched in red wine, standing tall in her own living room, saying to herself, "This is not the end of me. This is the beginning of you answering for what you've done." When the lights went out, it was as if the house itself decided to breathe for me, to cut off their laughter and remind them how fragile their power really was. 1 second, the dining room glowed with the warm shimmer of chandeliers, the clinking of glasses, and the cruel amusement that had been directed at me. And the next, everything collapsed into absolute blackness. I heard the startled gasps, the scraping of chairs against the hardwood floor, the nervous chuckles that turned into whispers. Someone said, "Damn Breaker, this old house falling apart." And another voice mocked, "Guess even the power can't stand her tonight." But underneath the forced humour, I could hear something else, an unease, a recognition that without light, they were just voices in the dark, stripped of the control that had seemed so certain moments earlier. I did not panic. I did not fumble for candles or curse the dark. I knew that silence, when used right, could be more terrifying than shouting, and so I let the darkness sit for a moment, thick as smoke, pressing down on all of us. I let them grope around, bumping into each other, spilling drinks, raising their voices in irritation, while I stood perfectly still, my body soaked in wine, my heart calm and deliberate. I knew the outage was temporary, a pause in the night's cruelty, but I also knew it was a signal, the moment I had been waiting for. In the pocket of my damp dress, my phone vibrated once, faint but clear, a reminder of the call I had already made, the plan I had already set in motion. The memory of that call replayed in my mind as I stood in the darkness, Earlier in the afternoon, before I slipped into my dress, I had dialed a number I had memorized long ago, a number I kept close for the moments when survival required more than silent endurance. On the other end of the line was an officer I had known for years, a man who had grown up in the same neighborhood, who had seen me walking to work in my uniform when he was still a boy riding his bicycle. I had told him quietly, without bitterness in my voice, that I feared this birthday gathering would not be the celebration it was supposed to be. "If I call you," I whispered, "don't ask questions. Just come." He hesitated for only a moment before answering, "You got it, ma'am." That was all. And with that, I had carried myself into the evening, knowing I was not as alone as they thought. In the pitch dark of my dining room, I pressed the button on my phone and whispered one word, my voice low enough to be drowned out by the shuffle of chairs and the muttering of irritated guests. Now. It was not a cry for help. It was the final movement of a decision I had already made. The phone screen glowed briefly against my hand, a tiny blue square in the surrounding black, and then I slipped it back into my pocket. Around me, they stumbled and cursed, their authority unraveling without light to frame it. Someone tried to joke again, their voice strained. Well, happy birthday to the Queen of Darkness. Maybe she planned this too. Laughter followed, thin and nervous this time, not the cruel roar of earlier. I could feel them searching for me in the dark, their eyes straining to locate the figure they had mocked only minutes ago. But I stayed silent, letting their discomfort grow, letting the pause stretch until the air was heavy. Then, as suddenly as it had vanished, the light returned. The chandelier flickered back to life, golden and sharp, revealing faces twisted in surprise. Some squinted against the sudden brightness, others blinked rapidly, embarrassed at their own panic. But what froze them, what carved the silence into stone, was not the return of electricity. It was what came with it, standing in the doorway, their presence filling the space more powerfully than any words I could have spoken, were two police officers in full uniform. Behind them, through the open door, more figures waited, the night air spilling in around their shoulders. The laughter died completely. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Someone muttered, "What the hell is this?" But no one dared to move. I felt every eye turn to me. The woman still soaked in red wine. The woman they thought too broken, too old, too invisible to fight back. I straightened my shoulders and met their stares with the calm certainty of someone who had carried enough silence for a lifetime. The officers said nothing at first. They simply scanned the room, taking in the spilled drinks, the broken glass on the floor, the faces of people who only moments ago had been bold enough to humiliate me. It was in that pause, that charged moment of exposure, that I felt the shift I had been waiting for. They had wanted me powerless, small, erased, but instead it was they who sat frozen in their chairs, their cruelty lit up like evidence under a spotlight. The officer closest to me stepped forward slowly, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor, and looked not at the guests, but at me. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice even, professional, but with a flicker of recognition that told me he remembered the call, remembered the woman who had warned him earlier in the day. I did not answer right away. I let the question hang there, let it remind every person in that room that tonight was no longer about their jokes, their games, their arrogance. Tonight was about accountability. In their silence, I could hear their minds racing, scrambling for excuses, for explanations that might make this intrusion vanish. I could already predict what they would say. They would claim it was a harmless prank, a misunderstanding, a private family matter. They would turn their voices honey-sweet, dripping with concern, pretending to be protective of me even as the stains of their laughter clung to my dress. But I knew the truth, and for the first time that evening, I felt the weight shift in my favor. The catalyst had arrived, and it was brighter than any chandelier, louder than any jeer. It was the knowledge that they were no longer in control of the story. I was. The first escalation came not from me raising my voice or from anyone at that table daring to apologize, but from the way the officers began to move through the room as if they were peeling away the layers of a rotten fruit, exposing what had been hidden under the surface for too long. The return of the lights had already shocked everyone into silence. But silence was never meant to last in that family, because silence makes cruelty obvious, and people who survive by belittling others cannot endure it. The moment the officers stepped inside, shoulders squared and notebooks ready, I saw panic flicker across familiar faces, the kind of panic that reveals itself only when people realize their power is no longer absolute. The wine still dripped from my dress. A dark trail across the floor followed me, and instead of wiping it away, I left it there deliberately. A stain no one could deny, a living record of what had just been done to me. The taller officer, a black man in his 40s with a calm face that carried no trace of humor, glanced down at the puddle near my chair and then back up at me as if to ask silently, "Do you want this written down?" And in that unspoken question was an acknowledgement of something I had carried for too many years. The decision of whether to keep protecting those who humiliated me or to let the world finally see them as they truly were. I breathed slowly, held his gaze, and nodded once. That was all he needed. He pulled out a pen, flipped open his notebook, and began writing. The scratching of that pen on paper was louder to me than any of the laughter that had filled the room earlier. It was the sound of truth being recorded, the sound of accountability taking root. One of my nieces shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her arms crossed tight against her chest, and I saw her eyes darting to the phone she had been recording on earlier, still face down on the table, the screen smeared with fingerprints. The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, noticed it too. She walked over, picked up the phone without asking, and looked at me again, waiting for a signal. I could have shrugged it off, could have pretended I didn't care, but I raised my chin slightly and said with a voice steadier than I expected, "Check it." That was enough. The officer tapped the screen, the device unlocked, and there it was, the video of them laughing as the wine spilled down my head, their voices taunting, the camera panning to my face as I sat motionless with my dignity bleeding into the carpet. The woman officer's mouth tightened. She turned the screen outward, letting everyone see the frozen image of me drenched in red, and the silence that followed was sharper than broken glass. My grandson looked away, ashamed. My son muttered something about it being a joke, but his voice cracked halfway through, betraying his fear. The officer didn't bother to respond. She simply slid the phone into an evidence bag and kept moving, her hands quick, efficient, gathering what she needed from a room full of people who now seemed smaller, diminished, shrunken by the reality of being observed. I remained standing, refusing to sit down again in that chair of humiliation. My back ached from the weight of the day, but I would not lower myself while others finally had to raise their eyes. The officers asked for identification, names, connections, and as each person answered, their voices lost more confidence. I had heard these same voices bark orders at me in my own kitchen, demand money from me as if my pension belonged to them, criticize my cooking, my clothes, my very existence. Now those voices stumbled, tripped, hesitated, because nothing strips arrogance faster than the presence of authority that cannot be bent with intimidation. When they asked me to explain what had happened, I spoke slowly, not as a victim, not as a woman pleading for sympathy, but as a witness giving testimony. I described the dinner, the toasts, the moment someone lifted a glass not to celebrate me, but to baptize me in humiliation. I described the laughter, the phones, the way even the youngest at the table joined in as if cruelty were a family tradition passed down like recipes. My words did not shake, and though my heart pounded, I held on to every detail, because details matter when truth has to be proven. I made sure they understood that this was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of belittlement, of financial exploitation, of emotional abuse disguised as jokes. I made sure they understood that this night, this birthday, was only the most visible chapter of a book I had been forced to write in silence for too long. As I spoke, I could see the shift taking place. Some of them lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet mine. Others sat rigid, anger flashing in their expressions, not because they felt guilt, but because they hated being exposed. My son clenched his jaw so tightly I thought it might break, and when he finally opened his mouth, it was to spit out, "She's exaggerating." It wasn't like that. It's a family thing. The officer's pen didn't stop moving. Family thing was the phrase abusers have always used to cover their tracks, and we all knew it. I looked directly at my son and said clearly enough for the officers to hear, "No, it's not a family thing. It's an abuse thing." That line cracked the air. Some gasped, others shifted uncomfortably, but I felt lighter having said it aloud, as though naming it released me from the burden of pretending it was anything else. The officers nodded, and one of them asked to see my phone. I handed it over, wine-stained and trembling in my hand, and they opened the call log that showed my earlier message, the whispered request for backup. Proof that I had sensed what was coming, and had chosen not to let it pass without consequence. That small detail mattered, because it showed intent. It showed that I was not irrational or hysterical, but prepared and determined. They began photographing the room, the broken glasses, the stains on the carpet, the marks on my dress, the puddle near my chair. The flash of the camera lit up the space like lightning, and with each click, I saw my relatives shrinking further into themselves, realizing that their cruelty was being catalogued, frozen into images that would outlast excuses. I did not smile, but inside me something steady and strong began to rise. For once, it wasn't just my word against theirs. For once, there were records, witnesses, evidence that couldn't be erased with laughter. The escalation was not loud, not violent, but it was irreversible. The balance had shifted, and everyone in that room felt it. They had begun the night believing they could humiliate me without consequence. But by the time the officers placed the last evidence bag on the table, it was clear that the narrative no longer belonged to them. I stood taller, still soaked, still trembling, but no longer invisible. I had stepped out of the shadows they tried to confine me to, and though the night was far from over, the first cracks in their fortress had appeared. I knew they would fight back, that they would twist their words and reach for the power of connections and status, but I also knew that this was only the beginning. For the first time in years, the truth had been spoken aloud and written down, and nothing they could say would erase the fact that the world had started listening. The midpoint of the night revealed itself not as a single explosion, but as a tightening of the air, a weight that pressed down until truth had no choice but to surface. And it began when the front door opened a second time, and the chill from the porch rolled through the dining room like a warning that the world beyond our walls had taken notice. Officer Daniels had been cataloguing the shattered glass and the streaks of wine that traced the floorboards like a map of the humiliation they had written across my body, and Officer Ruiz had just sealed another phone in an evidence bag, when a voice from the entryway tried to reclaim the room with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. He stepped in, wearing an expensive coat and a face trained to deliver verdicts, a patriarch practiced in turning shame into silence, and with him came the entitled posture of a person who believed the law was his to command rather than obey. Several at the table straightened, relief rippling through them as if salvation had just arrived, and my son's shoulders loosened in the way a boy's would when he hears his father's footsteps and decides the switch in his hand will do the punishing. For him, he introduced himself in a measured tone and reached into his pocket for a card he pushed toward the officers with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. The smile of a man accustomed to doors opening before knocking. He spoke about family and misunderstandings and the dangers of overreaction. He spoke about reputations and service and how these things look different in the light. And he spoke as if we were all actors in a minor domestic farce rather than witnesses to a ritual of degradation performed for the amusement of a bored audience. I watched Daniels keep his pen moving without looking up, nodding when necessary, letting the man's words pile up like leaves that would soon be bagged and carried away, while Ruiz stood a half step closer to me than before. The angle of her, shoulders saying plainly that this room's center of gravity had shifted, and she knew exactly where it now lived. The man talked about me without addressing me, the way powerful people do when they are anxious to erase a person while pretending to acknowledge her, suggesting that I was tired, that birthdays can be emotionally complex, that sometimes we take things the wrong way. And when he finally glanced in my direction, it was with the indulgent air of someone offering a kindly out to a child who doesn't understand adult matters. I let him finish, because interruptions feed those performances, and when he paused for the approving murmurs he expected, he found only the thick quiet of a room that had learned in the last 20 minutes to be careful with sound. Then I did something I had not allowed myself to do for years in front of these people. I told the whole truth without apology, and I did it to the body cameras and the notebooks and the witnesses in the doorway as much as to the family that had decided my dignity was an acceptable party joke. I spoke of money first, because money had been the silent chain slung around my neck, and I described years of transfers from my account to theirs, months when my prescriptions waited at the pharmacy while their vacations did not, weeks when the grocery list bent around their preferences and not mine, and the way they framed it as love so that I would feel stingy for asking where the kindness was when the bill came due. I described phone calls in which I was summoned like a servant, the little digs about age and memory, the casual "you wouldn't get it" that was smirked in my direction any time I asked a question about the new debts created in my name. I spoke about the messages saved in my phone, not the ones full of profanity and threats. Those are easy for people to call aberrations. But the tidy, polite ones that said, "Send it today, and don't make me ask again." A paper trail of entitlement that could pass for etiquette until you lined them up beside my bank statements and saw the outline of a theft that dared you to call it by a nicer name. As I spoke, Ruiz asked gentle questions that were not meant to lead me but to anchor the timeline, and Daniels moved his camera deliberately so both the table and my face were held in the same frame. The patriarch at the door tried to intervene, suggesting we not turn this into a spectacle, and Ruiz thanked him for his concern without granting it authority, then asked my niece to unlock her cloud account so the clips we had not yet seen could be mirrored to an evidence drive. Eyes widened down the table as the arithmetic of reputation began to shift. Footage that felt like a private amusement on a couch would not look so adorable on a screen owned by the state. Someone murmured that recordings were illegal without consent, and Daniels, without breaking rhythm, explained that consent had been given the second they lifted those phones to perform the act they were now so eager to bury, and that, moreover, the material was evidence of a possible crime committed in plain view. The front yard was no longer simply a place with a porch light and a trimmed hedge. Silhouettes gathered behind the officers on the threshold. Neighbours who had heard voices and seen patrol cars and been drawn by the gravity that arrives whenever the pretense of a happy family cracks open. Among them, I recognized a woman from 2 doors down who always waved when I wheeled my garbage can to the curb, and a man who once helped me carry a box of winter blankets up the stairs when my back was bad. Their faces did not show the cruel curiosity I had feared. What I saw in them was something closer to mournful recognition, the look of people who understand how long a person can suffer 7 feet from your living room without you ever knowing the shape of her loneliness. The man raised a hand and said he had a door camera, that it captured sound on the walkway, that earlier in the evening it had recorded a burst of shrill laughter, and then my voice saying, "Please stop," broken by a chorus of sneers. Daniels asked him to email the footage, and he did so on the spot, thumbs trembling. And the ping of the arriving file chimed from the officer's device like a bell that marks a boundary you cannot cross back over. Inside the room, my son tried once more to seize control, leaning forward with the swagger of a man who believed bluster could stitch a torn story back together, and he began to deliver a speech about how this family handles its own, about tradition and the danger of airing private matter in public, and about the indignity of strangers judging what they could not possibly understand. He said the word mother as if it were a talisman against scrutiny, as if saying it loudly could transform me back into the appliance they were used to pushing buttons on. I listened the way you listen to a thunderstorm after the lightning has already struck the tree in your yard. It may be loud, but the damage has been done, and the sky is no longer in charge. When he finished, expecting nods from his allies and eye contact from the officers, I turned to him and explained softly that protecting him had been my work, but protecting the truth was now my job, and that one kind of care had ended the moment he raised his glass to baptize me in contempt. The midpoint landed when Ruiz asked if I wanted to make an on-camera statement, and I said yes, without a tremor. And when she tapped the body cam and the tiny red light blinked alive, I felt years of swallowed explanations rise in me like breath after a long dive. I told the camera my name and age and the date. I pointed to the chair where I had been seated, and the bottles on the sideboard, and the damp dress clinging to my spine. And I said in the same tone I have used to comfort frightened patients that humiliation is a kind of violence, that laughter can bruise a soul as surely as a hand can bruise a face, and that we must stop excusing one because the other leaves a more obvious mark. I explained that the party was not an accident that got out of hand, but a crescendo of a pattern that would continue unless interrupted. And I said to the record that I was interrupting it tonight, here, with all of them present to bear witness. You could feel the temperature shift a few degrees with those words, because declarations have power when they are made to an archive instead of a room that forgets the next morning. While I spoke, the patriarch tried a different tactic, lowering his voice and offering what he called a path forward, suggesting a family apology, a private restitution, a reconsideration that would spare everyone the ugliness of paperwork. He looked at me as if he were offering mercy, and at the officers as if he were offering efficiency. But what he was offering was a return to the arrangement that had served them so well. My pain tucked away in a corner, my money flowing silently. Under the table, my name invoked only when the check cleared. I thanked him for the clarity of his proposal and declined it with equal clarity. And then I handed Daniels a plain folder from the sideboard drawer, the one I had prepared that afternoon in a moment of private resolve while the sweet potatoes roasted and the cornbread cooled. Inside were printouts of bank statements marked in yellow where the transfers had gone out on the 1st and 15th, copies of texts demanding cash under the guise of emergencies that miraculously aligned with airline receipts and concert tickets, and a list of dates when my prescriptions went unfilled while their subscription boxes arrived right on time. He read quickly, not because he didn't care, but because years on the job had taught him how to separate noise from signal. And when he looked up, his expression was not pitying, but professionally alert. From the doorway, the neighbor with the door camera cleared his throat and said something else, that his wife had heard raised voices earlier in the week and had written down phrases because she feared she might need to remember them. And he lifted a small spiral notebook where she had scribbled the sentence, "That's what you get," repeated twice, the kind of cold chant that turns a person into an object in a heartbeat. Ruiz photographed the page, thanked him, and asked if his wife would be willing to write a short statement. He said she was nervous, but would try. The possibility of witnesses multiplied like lanterns in a dark field, each small light revealing the shape of the night we were actually standing in. And in that glow, my family's confidence withered. A call came over Daniel's radio, and he stepped to the side to answer, then returned to the table to say that a supervisor was on the way, which meant this was no longer the kind of call that could be tucked under a generic incident number. It would be reviewed with the attention of people trained to recognize patterns and to label them accurately. The patriarch's face flushed at that, and he made the mistake powerful men make when the mask slips. He tried a threat dressed as a prediction, hinting at complaints and internal emails, and the kind of pressure he presumed would make a working cop. "Shrink?" Daniels met his gaze with the unruffled steadiness of a man who has already outlived a dozen such predictions, and invited him to have a seat while they finished the preliminary steps. It was the quietest rebuke I had ever seen, and it accomplished what shouting never could. It forced a man accustomed to towering over every room to sit down and wait his turn. In that enforced pause, with the neighbors lingering in the doorway and the officers sweeping the room with their careful questions, the shape of the night inverted itself. I was no longer the object of their laughter, but the axis around which the facts turned. And my voice was the metronome that kept the story from racing ahead or slowing into sentimentality. I did not pretend to be strong for their benefit. I told the body cam that I was exhausted and humiliated and furious, and that I would be all those things in the morning too, but that I would not be silent again, and I would not negotiate the price of my dignity in a back hallway where men smoke expensive cigars and call it compromise. The midpoint required a choice, and I made it openly, with my name attached, with my neighbors listening, with the evidence on the table, and the stain on my dress drying into a dark medal I had never asked to wear. When the supervisor arrived and stepped into the room, he didn't look at the patriarch first, or at my son, or at the spread of food congealing into a monument to appetite without gratitude. He looked at me. He looked at the camera lights, and he looked at the evidence bags, and then he asked Ruiz, in a voice that carried no drama but a great deal of consequence, whether we had grounds to initiate a protective order and whether a social worker should be contacted regarding the minor who had been present during the incident. The phrase protective order did what all my explanations could not do for certain people at that table. It translated my suffering into a language they were not fluent in, but could not ignore. And the name of a social worker made a few chairs. Scrape, as if the wood itself resisted being associated with outcomes that cannot be laughed away. I answered the supervisor's clarifying questions and gave consent for photographs and for a victim advocate referral. And with that, the night crossed its equator, moving from a ritual of humiliation to a process of accountability with a rhythm and procedures and boxes that would be checked whether my relatives approved or not. By the time the door swung shut again against the winter air and the neighbors drifted back across the lawn, the house had changed temperature, and so had I. The midpoint did not make me triumphant, because triumph is not what you feel when you are still wet and cold and aching, but it made me sovereign again. And that was more than I had hoped for when I put on my dress and my mother's earrings and told myself to smile no matter what came. The patriarch's card lay on the table beside a sealed envelope of screenshots, a neat symbol of everything this night had taught me. Lineage and title can dress themselves in authority, but the camera and the ledger and the recorded word refuse to curtsy. I stood in the middle of my dining room with the officers beside me, and knew with a certainty that frightened me a little that whatever they did next, whatever calls they made or favours they tried to cash, we had already crossed the threshold, and the story would not be dragged back into the dark. The unfair turn arrived the way rot creeps into good wood, quietly at first, and then all at once. And I felt it the moment the supervisor's radio crackled, and his face rearranged itself into that neutral mask people wear when they've just been told, to pretend nothing is happening. He stepped aside to take the call, and when he returned, his voice was careful, professional, the kind of careful that makes you brace before you even hear the words. And he explained that the on-call judge had reviewed the preliminary notes and declined to issue an emergency protective order tonight, citing insufficient evidence of immediate physical danger. A phrase so tidy it could fold and tuck away a woman's humiliation without wrinkling a single sleeve. The room inhaled at once, and I watched the patriarch's mouth twitch into the kind of smile a man hides by straightening his tie. Power recognizes its reflection and nods to it, and he barely bothered to hide his satisfaction. Ruiz didn't flinch, and Daniels didn't stop recording, but the air shifted, and everyone at that table felt it, because nothing emboldens a bully like the sense that morning paperwork can be delayed until Monday. What hurt wasn't only the judge's refusal, it was how quickly my family understood the new script and slid into their lines. My niece, who had filmed the worst of it, pressed her palms together and said she was uncomfortable with the government accessing our private family memories. And she invoked a string of words she must have learned from a boyfriend who once studied criminal justice at a community college, something about consent and clouds and constitutional rights. And for a moment, it worked, because bodies have to live inside rules, even when those rules were written by men who never imagined a night like mine. Ruiz explained that the recording had already been in plain view, that it documented a potential offence, that consent had been functionally given by the act itself, but my niece had already snatched 2 other phones from the table and locked them. With shaking fingers, and on the far end of the room, my cousin swiped and then announced that a clip had auto-deleted, her eyes round with mock shock at the miracle of selective technology. Daniels bagged what he could, the doorbell camera files safely received, my dress photographed, my name and statement sealed under the red light of the body cam. But I could feel evidence thinning like soup stretched with too much water. And across, from me, the patriarch sat back with the unhurried patience of a man who knows delay is its own verdict. Then came the softer knife. My daughter, who had spent the last hour shaking under a throw blanket while strangers finally spoke to her as if she were worth more than a chore list, stared at her hands and whispered that she didn't want to press charges, that she just wanted peace, that she was tired, and could we please not make it worse. And though Ruiz reminded her gently that the report could proceed on observed facts, I felt the case buckle. You can't blame a trembling woman for begging the night to end, but the system loves a recantation, like drought loves rain. And my son heard it, seized it, amplified it, rolling his voice into a reasonable register and telling the supervisor we were all overwrought, that alcohol had blurred intentions, that perhaps I had misunderstood a clumsy toast, and he even managed a tiny laugh as if to prove his point, because laughter can sand the edges off cruelty until it looks like an accident. I watched a man who once begged me in the middle of the night to check under his bed for monsters tell the state that the only monster in the room was confusion, and I swallowed the kind of scream that doesn't open your mouth but tears something in your chest. The next tactic came dressed in concern. The patriarch produced a crisp envelope from his coat and, with a gesture so practiced it felt rehearsed, presented a notarized letter from a cousin with a medical license in another county, a short opinion declaring my daughter emotionally fragile and advising minimizing external agitation. And though Ruiz set it aside as irrelevant to what the body cam had already seen, its purpose was not to persuade the officers, but to seed a narrative for the file and for any morning eyes that might review it. Then he turned that same velvet blade toward me, sighing as if burdened by compassion, and suggested to the supervisor that my understandable stress could be contributing to escalation, that perhaps I would benefit from rest away from the house this evening, and before I could spit the word out, he gave it air. Trespass. He referenced an email the homeowner association had on file about prior disturbances, a complaint likely drafted by the same hand that had poured wine on my head, and he wondered aloud whether, for everyone's safety, I should be asked to leave my own dining room until things cooled. It didn't hold. Daniels checked the records and confirmed what the deed already knew, that the roof above us had been paid for by the woman still dripping in red, and the idea of trespass stalled right there. But I understood the play, and they understood that I understood, and sometimes that is enough to exhaust you in a way sleep cannot cure. A neighbor stepped forward again, brave and steady, offering to speak on the record about the laughter that had curdled into chanting. And while Ruiz took his statement, the patriarch leaned toward my grandson and murmured something that made the boy flinch and look at me with a confused kind of grief, and I knew in my bones the sentence, even if I couldn't hear it. If she keeps this up, you won't see her again. By the time the supervisor returned from a second call, the night had settled into an uneasy stalemate. He said dispatch would note the incident, that a detective would follow up, that victims' services would call me by noon, that the phones collected would be analyzed pursuant to policy, and that given the judge's decision, there would be no removals this evening unless someone volunteered to leave. The volunteers, of course, were always the ones with the least power to leave. The people with coats on the backs of chairs and bills in their names do not vacate on principle. My relatives sat tucked into my furniture like seeds in pulp, their confidence newly watered, and I realized the system had handed me a familiar menu. Accept the insult and carry the file into mourning, or rage against it, and give them the spectacle. They needed to turn the story back into a caricature of an angry old woman. I chose the third, quieter option that still felt like a cut, the one that protects your future fight at the cost of tonight's satisfaction. I stepped toward the hallway, collecting my keys with a steadiness I did not feel, and told Ruiz I was going to a neighbor's for the night, so the detectives could do their work without me in the room. And she nodded with a kind of respect that didn't taste like surrender. The patriarch pretended to thank me for being reasonable, and my son managed a small performative "we love you" that made a cousin wipe at phantom tears. And in that theatre, I felt the old urge to explain myself rise like heat. The urge we are, taught as black women to carry like a vaccination card. Proof that we are sane, calm, decent, grateful, not dangerous. But I let it die in my throat, because you cannot argue a man out of a mirror he loves. I kissed my grandson's forehead, told my daughter I would be back in the morning with someone who would stand beside her, whose salary didn't depend on a politician's handshake, and then I walked past the table where a card with a judge's name lay. next to a sealed evidence bag, past the sideboard where my mother's earrings waited in a small dish, past the doorway where neighbours had become witnesses, and into the cold that met me like a truth that hurts but does not lie. Outside, the winter air pressed the wine smell from my dress like a confession, and across the lawn, porch lights had bloomed in quiet solidarity. Ruiz followed me onto the steps and, without shutting off her camera, said softly that declined tonight does not mean declined tomorrow, that patterns matter, that paper tallies patience and harm with the same ink, and that sometimes the first no is the preface to a better yes. I nodded, because hope must be portioned carefully or it burns through you too fast. And as I crossed into my neighbour's hallway, I heard behind me the muffled clink of glassware being gathered by hands that believed they had won. Let them think it, I told myself. Let them sleep inside their illusion, because an unfair turn changes the route, not the destination. And if this night taught me anything, it is that I am done setting myself on fire to light other people's lies. In the quiet of a borrowed guest room, I wrote down the names and times while they were still hot in my head. I folded my dress into a trash bag, so no one could say the stains were imagined. And I placed my phone on the charger like a promise. Because the most unjust thing about this turn was not that a judge said no to my dignity for a few hours. It was that they believed that no meant the story belonged to them again. It doesn't. The next day did not wait for me to gather myself. It came like a hammer, loud and unyielding, and by the time the morning light bled through my neighbour's curtains, I understood that the Whitlock family, emboldened by the judge's refusal, had already begun to prepare their counterattack. I had barely washed the smell of wine from my hair when my phone started buzzing with messages from numbers I didn't recognise. Anonymous voices leaving voicemails that called me bitter, crazy, unwell, each one slipping in details only family could. No, the strategy was obvious. They would flood the air around me with doubt until I doubted myself, until I considered silence safer than truth. I thought of Emily still trembling, of her eyes wet from years of humiliation, and the decision settled in me like iron. I could not let them write the story of our pain. When I arrived at the precinct for the follow-up meeting with the detective, I carried my trash bag with the stained dress folded neatly inside, my handwritten notes from the night, and the names of every person who had witnessed or recorded a fragment of what happened. The detective, a weary man with grey at his temples, looked at me with something between sympathy and fatigue. He had seen cases like this collapse under family pressure too many times. He warned me that without my daughter's active cooperation, the district attorney might not prioritise it, that the Whitlocks were not only wealthy, but connected, that Harold Whitlock had presided over half the county's trials before retirement and still held sway in the courthouse cafeteria. I told him I was not asking for sympathy. I was filing evidence. He nodded, placed my bag in the evidence locker, and promised that the files would be reviewed. Still, I could feel his doubt, not of me, but of a system that feeds on certainty and rarely grants it to women like me. By the time I stepped outside, the Whitlocks had already made their next move. A local blog that thrives on scandal had posted a short item about an altercation at a holiday gathering involving a well-known retired judge's family and an agitated relative with a history of emotional instability. The description was just vague enough to avoid defamation, but sharp enough to cut. My phone lit up with old acquaintances forwarding the link, asking if it was me, some with concern, some with that thinly veiled pleasure people take in someone else's fall. My son had wasted no time turning humiliation into a public shield. If I roared too loud, he would point to that article and say, "Look, even the papers know she's unwell." I walked home with fury pushing me faster than my legs wanted to go. At my neighbour's table the night before, I had written every word down, but now I realised the fight could not stay on paper. I needed allies, people who could not be dismissed as bitter old women. I called Jake, the former student-turned-officer who had witnessed part of the night from the porch. He answered quickly, his voice steady. He told me he had already filed an internal note about what he saw, that he had heard enough through the window to corroborate abuse, and that if called, he would testify. His loyalty was a spark in the grey. I thanked him, and he told me quietly that I had taught him once never to back down from injustice in the dojo, and he had not forgotten. That afternoon, when I went to collect the rest of my belongings from Emily's house, the escalation became brutal. Ryan had changed the locks, and through the frosted glass I could see Evelyn's smug silhouette holding a phone, no doubt recording me for their archives of evidence. A note was taped to the door, stating that I was not welcome until further notice, and that any attempt to enter would be treated as trespass. My own daughter's home, half of whose furniture I had helped purchase, was being guarded against me as though I were the threat. I didn't shout, didn't pound. Instead, I stood there long enough for neighbours to see, long enough for the Whitlocks to know I wasn't skulking away. Then I left, because escalation isn't always about raising your voice. It's about refusing to vanish. The following days blurred into a campaign of pressure. Emily called me twice, whispering that she loved me, but that she couldn't endure the daily accusations inside the house, that every time she defended me, they told her she was ungrateful, broken, a burden, and that if she didn't denounce me publicly, they would cut her off completely. My heart broke at the sound of her apology, as though love itself were a crime. I told her that silence would not save her, that her suffering was not her shame, but the line was always cut short, sometimes mid-sentence, as though someone yanked the phone from her hand. I kept every call log, every dropped connection, another ledger of control. Then came the legal letter, hand-delivered by a courier with a smirk he tried to hide. It accused me of harassment, of defamation, of creating false narratives that endangered the reputation of a respected family. It demanded I cease contact with Emily for her mental health. The hypocrisy was as sharp as glass. They wanted to twist my daughter's pain into a weapon against her own mother. I carried that letter to the detective, who scanned it with disgust and added it to the file. But he warned me again. The Whitlocks had money for lawyers. I needed more than testimony. I needed proof that would stand even if Emily faltered. That night, I called the neighbour with the security camera, and together we sat on her couch watching the playback. The porch, the laughter, my daughter shivering in a thin blouse while voices jeered from inside. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to show the world what kind of people the Whitlocks truly were. The escalation reached its second wave when a child, a grandchild of Evelyn, no more than 10, slipped a folded note into my hand while passing me on the street. It was scrawled in shaky letters. Aunt Em cries every night. That small act of courage shattered me and steeled me at once. If children could see, if they could sense the rot, then silence was complicity. I realized the Whitlocks were losing their grip on appearances, that cracks were spreading in the facade. They would double down, of course, but every mask they wore would grow thinner. And so I escalated in my own way. I contacted a journalist I had once coached years ago, now working at the local paper. I gave her what I had: the bagged dress, the video, the neighbour's testimony, the legal threats. She listened, eyes widening, and promised discretion until I authorised her to print. For the first time in days, I felt not just like a mother fighting, but like a woman arming herself for battle. The Whitlocks responded exactly as expected, by circling their wagons tighter. Emily was forbidden from leaving the house without a chaperone, her phone monitored, her emails no doubt intercepted. They thought prison bars made of family ties would hold forever. But they underestimated the patience of a woman who had carried students through years of discipline, who had survived lean times and lonely nights. They thought a black grandmother would tire and sit down. They didn't know that survival had taught me endurance sharper than their cruelty. The escalation was no longer just about them humiliating me. It was about who would define reality. They wanted the story to be that I was hysterical, bitter, vengeful. I wanted the story to be the truth, that a family with power had turned their own blood into a spectacle of abuse and thought wealth would shield them. Every day I added to my file. Names, times, words, even the way Evelyn's voice slurred on recordings, the way Ryan's arrogance tipped into threats. Every day I reminded myself that escalation doesn't end with noise. It ends with exposure. And I was ready to burn every illusion they had built if it meant Emily could breathe again. It broke open on a Thursday afternoon that felt like late winter trying to turn into spring. The kind of day when the air lifts a degree and you tell yourself it's nothing and then realize everything is changing. And I knew it the moment the journalist called to say her editor had cleared the story for publication that evening. If I gave my authorization and one last on-the-record quote that said exactly what I meant for the world to hear. I stood at my kitchen counter with the evidence folders laid out like a map of the last 48 hours, and the trash bag with my stained dress folded in a square that felt holy in its ugliness. And I spoke slowly into the phone so my words would not be softened by regret later, telling her that humiliation is not a private ritual when it becomes a pattern, that a family's reputation is not a shield against truth, and that the worst scars are sometimes the ones that smell like Merlot and laughter. She exhaled the way people do when they realize the ground they stand on is about to tilt, thanked me, and said she would call the detective for comment. And I hung up with my hand shaking, because it is one thing to gather your courage in a neighbor's hallway and quite another to place it on a page that strangers will unfold at their breakfast tables. The detective called 20 minutes later, not to dissuade me, but to tell me something I could barely believe at first, that the tech team had been able to pull partial data from one of the seized phones even after the panic deletions, that the cloud sync had betrayed the arrogance of its owner, and that a series of short clips existed, showing the toast turning into a drenching, the cheer turning into a chant, the camera catching my face as I sat and did not bow my head. He sounded tired and pleased at once, like a man who had expected the whole thing to slide into the ditch and had just found a handhold. And he told me that with my cooperation and the neighbour's footage and the voicemail threats I had saved, the assistant district attorney was prepared to petition the same judge for a protective order, only this time with teeth. I closed my eyes and felt something in my chest loosen. Not relief exactly, but the release that comes when you realize you are not crazy and you are not alone. And there is a path you can walk that does not depend on the mercy of the people who hurt you. I called Emily, praying her phone would not be snatched away this time, and when she answered, I heard a hush in her voice that told me she was speaking from a corner of a room with the door pressed gently to the jamb and a towel at the crack to muffle sound. And I told her what the detective had said and what the paper planned to do. And I asked her, not as a demand, but as a lifeline, whether she would stand with me if the officers came with the order. She did not answer right away, and in that space I heard the years of learned silence shifting inside her like a stack of plates in a moving truck. And then she whispered that she was tired of crying into a pillow and tired of being told she was the reason other people were cruel, and that if someone stood between her and the next wave, she would step into that shelter even if her legs shook. I told her I would be there before the light faded, and I told her to pack her documents and her grandmother's ring, and nothing else, because everything else could be replaced. And after a pause, I heard a sound I had not heard in years, not quite a laugh, but a small breaking noise that meant hope had entered a room that had forgotten how to hold it. The courthouse moves differently when the press is watching, and by the time I reached the clerk's window with the detective at my side and the neighbor behind me carrying a thumb drive in a sandwich bag, the air felt charged in that bureaucratic way. That means someone important has glanced at your file and decided they cannot pretend not to see you. The assistant district attorney met us in the hallway with a stack of papers clipped tight, asked me 3 precise questions, to which I gave precise answers, and then he disappeared into chambers with the detective while I sat on a wooden bench and stared at the floor, scuffed by shoes that had dragged through their own tired dramas. When the door opened again, he did not smile, and he did not grandstand. He simply handed me the signed temporary protective order bearing the same judge's signature that had refused me 2 nights before, the ink still wet enough to smudge if I brushed a finger across it, and I felt heat in my eyes that I swallowed down because there was no time to cry, not when the clock had finally decided to tick in my favor. We drove as a small convoy toward the Whitlock house, the detective's unmarked sedan in front and my car behind, and the journalist's vehicle somewhere down the street, because she had said she would not approach the door, but would wait for the public, part of the story, to become public. And as the tires hummed against the asphalt, I rehearsed what I would and would not do. I would not shout insults that gave them a new costume to dress me in. I would not touch anyone even if they shoved me. I would not argue with the patriarch when he performed that paternal concern that tastes like ashes. I would ask for my daughter. I would stand inside the shape of the law, carved by a pen that had said no and had now said yes. I would not leave without Emily unless the officers forced me, and if they did, I would sit on the lawn and wait with the cameras until the house could not stand the look of its own bricks. The sun was tipping toward the neighbor's birch tree when we turned onto the street, and already silhouettes had gathered on porches because word runs ahead of patrol cars like a schoolchild with a rumor. And I saw several faces I recognized from the night of the party. People who had chosen quiet then and now stood with arms crossed, not hostile but wary, measuring whether history was about to be made or just rewritten. The detective parked, clipped the paper to a board, and told me plainly to stay a half step behind him, no matter what came out of their mouths. And then he walked up the path and pressed the bell. The chime sounded delicate, ridiculous against the weight of the moment, and when the door opened, it was Evelyn with her lipstick perfect and a glassless hand that kept smoothing her blouse as if to erase wrinkles that lived under her skin. She began to speak in that syruped tone, but the detective cut gently across, announcing himself and reading the core of the order with the voice of a man who has learned that authority needs no thunder when the paper is good. The performance arrived on cue. Ryan, in a pressed shirt with a smile designed for Christmas cards, insisted there had been a misunderstanding, that Emily was resting, that she did not wish to see visitors. And then Harold stepped forward from the hallway like a statue, deciding to move, and asked whether this could be discussed privately to avoid embarrassment for all concerned. The detective did not step back. He asked to see Emily, and he asked to confirm whether firearms were present, and he asked that voices remain at a conversational level. And then, beyond their shoulders, I saw my daughter on the stairs with her bag clutched to her chest, and a courage so raw on her face it looked like new skin. And for a second, the sound in my ears turned to ocean because I had been braced for another retreat, and instead, here she was, her eyes on me, and then on the paper, and then on the officer. And she said in a voice so even it made me ache that she was ready to leave now. Harold tried the last weapon, the one that had worked for decades, moving his hands in that judicial way and pronouncing that removal under these circumstances would be destabilizing for a fragile woman, and that he would take responsibility for her well-being. And the detective answered with the line that split the evening open: that responsibility had been misused, and that tonight the state would hold it. And he stepped aside and let Emily pass down the stairs and placed his body quietly between her and the mouths that wanted to swallow her courage. Evelyn hissed a word I will not repeat, and Ryan reached toward the banister like he might clutch the air and make it a leash. But behind me, a second unit had rolled up, and an officer stood in the doorway now as a silent reminder that some doors close to keep people out and some to keep them in, and that this one would not close until the order had been obeyed. We did not run. We walked, and each step felt like pushing through thick water, and the house seemed to hum with thwarted appetite. And when we reached the stoop, I heard the rustle of neighbours shifting, and I heard the low staccato of a camera shutter from the edge of the sidewalk, and I placed my hand on Emily's back and felt the tremor there. Not just fear, but the electricity that comes when a body that has been braced for harm is allowed to move without flinching. At the curb, the journalist did not call out questions. She simply looked at Emily and lowered her camera for one beat, as if to say, "I see you." And then she lifted it again, because seeing is not enough if you will not show. Harold made one last show at the threshold, threatening complaints and consequences, and a storm of paperwork that he promised would rain down on everyone involved. And the detective nodded in that polite way you learn from years of being threatened by men with monogrammed shirts. And then he handed Harold a copy of the order, and another officer logged the time, and we slid into my car, with the doors shutting like the punctuation Emily deserved. Only then, with the seatbelt across her chest and the house growing smaller in the mirror, did she let out a sound like a sob that refused to be only sadness. And I reached over and held her hand, and she said she had been packing and unpacking her bag for 2 days, because she didn't believe rescue existed for people like her unless they were dying. And I told her rescue is just a name for the moment you believe your own story more than theirs. At the station, the victim advocate waited with a thermos of tea and a folder that contained forms and phone numbers, and a tiny card that said in large letters, "You are not at fault." And while M signed and answered and paused and restarted, the journalist's story hit the paper's site and began its own journey. And the photo the editor chose was not my stained dress or the front door with its wreath, but the porch camera still of Emily curled in a chair under December's breath while a dining room glowed behind her. And the headline did not say scandal or drama. It said what it was: pattern of humiliation alleged at retired judge's family gathering. Protective order granted after video emerges. My phone began to vibrate on the desk, and this time the messages were not threats. They were women and men from church and from the dojo and from the street who had seen us and were saying, "We believe you, and if belief does not mend broken skin, it can still lay a net under you when you step out into the air." That night, when the building quieted and the advocate found a bed for Emily in a shelter that looked nothing like a stereotype, but instead like a clean room with a lock and a quilt someone had stitched in a circle of strangers, I walked into the courtyard to breathe and found the detective smoking a cigarette he kept hidden in his palm like a secret he knew better than to share. And he told me without looking up that there would be a hearing within 10 days, that the phones would give up more than they meant to, that the ADA had already requested subpoenas for cloud accounts, and that the paper had made other victims call in with details that would matter if they chose to testify. And he said he didn't promise outcomes because outcomes are a language no honest man can speak in this line of work, But he promised process, and he promised he would keep saying my daughter's name in rooms where men had learned to forget it. I told him that was more than anyone had promised us in a long time. I drove home under a sky that had lost its colour, and I parked and sat in the dark for a minute before going inside because I was afraid of the quiet and what it would ask of me. And then I unlocked my door and walked into my house and placed my mother's earrings back in their dish and hung the trash bag with my dress on a hook because it still had its work to do. And I looked at myself in the mirror and said out loud that we had not won, and we had not finished, and we had not even survived. Yet in the way people mean when they say that word as if it is an end point. But we had climbed out of a room where laughter was a weapon, and into a room where words were written down, and names were attached, and light could be called for. And that is what passes for a climax in real life, not a thunderclap or a tidy bow, but a door opening and a person walking through while other people watch and cannot stop them. The house was behind us now, and though its walls still seemed to hum with the threats hurled from inside, distance turned them into echoes that no longer carried weight. In the days that followed, everything felt both unbearably fast and strangely suspended, like life was rushing to rearrange itself while my body moved in slow motion. Emily slept the first 2 nights in the shelter with the kind of restless exhaustion that shakes a person even in dreams. I would wake to hear her whispering apologies into her pillow, words meant for children she had lost, for years wasted in silence, for me, for herself. I sat beside her and smoothed her hair, as if she were still the little girl who used to wake me at 3 a.m. after nightmares of storms. And I reminded her with every stroke that she had nothing left to apologize for. Survival is never shameful. What is shameful is the cruelty that makes survival necessary. The story in the paper had spread far beyond our county. Calls came from women who had sat at Whitlock dinner tables and endured their own humiliations. Women who had been neighbours long enough to know that Emily's absence from gatherings was never just shyness. Women who had swallowed their doubts because the family name carried weight like a badge. Some of them left their names. Some asked for anonymity, but all of them confirmed what we already knew. The Whitlocks had perfected the art of turning pain into ritual, of coating cruelty in wine and tradition. The assistant district attorney collected each statement carefully, weaving a net of testimony that could no longer be dismissed as hysteria or revenge. Meanwhile, the Whitlocks raged. Evelyn called twice, her voice a syrup that failed to cover the venom underneath, warning me that the law is fickle, that judges come and go, but reputations are forever. Ryan sent a single text to Emily, 3 words. "You'll regret this." She deleted it without answering, but I kept a screenshot, adding it to the file. Harold's allies at the courthouse tried to lean on the ADA, murmuring about family matters and misunderstandings. But the video clips and the neighbour's camera made denial impossible. Power can bend perception, but it cannot erase what is seen and heard by too many eyes and ears. For Emily, the unravelling was not clean. Freedom rarely arrives as a single door swinging open. It came in tremors, panic when a car slowed too long outside the shelter, tears at the sight of a wine glass in the cafeteria, guilt that tasted sharper than hunger. I told her healing does not follow courtroom calendars, that it is slower and more personal than any verdict. She nodded, but sometimes asked me whether it would have been easier if she had stayed quiet. I reminded her of the child's note slipped into my hand, of the tiny scrawl saying Aunt Em cries every night. If silence teaches children that cruelty is normal, then every risk we took was worth it. The hearing came within 10 days. The courtroom was filled with the smell of old wood and cold air from a malfunctioning vent. The Whitlocks sat in a row, polished, rehearsed, their lawyer delivering arguments about family tension, about exaggerations, about depression twisting perspective. But then the ADA played the porch recording, the laughter, the taunts, my daughter's thin shoulders trembling. The room shifted. Jurors do not need to be mothers to recognize cruelty. Even the judge's gavel seemed less sharp against the weight of those sounds. By the time Jake testified about what he witnessed through the window, the Whitlock's veneer was cracking. And when the voicemail threats were played, Evelyn's face drained of its practiced calm. The protective order was extended, and charges were filed for harassment and neglect. The law, imperfect and slow, had finally drawn a line they could not step over without consequence. Walking out of that courthouse with Emily beside me, the winter sun felt different on my face. Not warm, but honest. The kind of light that shows cracks and colours without flattery. Reporters clustered at the steps, cameras flashing, voices calling my name. I did not stop for long, but I did say one thing, the only thing that mattered. No woman should freeze on a porch while her family feasts inside. Then I guided Emily to the car, because spectacle was never the point. Safety was. At home, the silence of my own walls wrapped around us like a quilt. I cooked soup, simple and salted just right, and we ate slowly at the table that had so often been empty. Emily stared at her bowl for a long time before she whispered that she could taste love in it, and then she cried. But these were not the hollow tears of despair. They were the tears of someone beginning to believe that tomorrow might belong to her. In the weeks that followed, Emily started counselling, and I returned to the dojo for the first time in months. My students gathered around me, some with cautious questions, some with unspoken solidarity. I told them only what they needed to know, that resilience is not about never breaking, but about choosing how to stand again. The bruises on Emily's spirit would take longer to fade than any on her skin, but each day she rose from bed, each laugh that escaped her throat, was a small triumph. The Whitlocks continued their manoeuvres, filing countersuits, whispering about vendettas, but the tide had turned. Their name no longer shielded them. Every attempt to discredit us only reminded people of the arrogance that had been exposed. For once, I did not carry the weight alone. Community carried it with me. And though justice is rarely perfect, dignity reclaimed is a kind of victory no court can take away. One night, weeks later, Emily and I walked past the house where everything had cracked open. It stood dark, shutters drawn, wreath wilted on the door. She paused, trembling, and I asked whether she wanted to cross the street. She shook her head. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I want to walk past. I want to know it doesn't own me anymore." So we did. And in that small act, I saw the true resolution, not in the court papers or the headlines, but in my daughter's steady stride past the place where she had once been made to shiver. I knew then that the story was not about revenge or spectacle. It was about survival, about reclaiming breath, about teaching the world that cruelty hidden behind lace curtains is still cruelty. And as I locked our door that night, I whispered a promise to myself and to every woman who had ever sat trembling in the cold. Your pain will not be buried in silence. Not while I still have a voice.